When the HOA took it upon themselves to illegally bolt my ranch gates shut, they forgot one thing. My goats don't like being trapped. What followed wasn't just revenge. It was total pasture-fueled chaos. Their manicured lawns, gone, their rules, crushed under hooves. And as the neighborhood screamed, the HOA learned the hard way. Don't mess with a rancher and his herd. The situation began with what the HOA labeled as a security upgrade. They had been holding meetings about enforcing uniformity and protecting the image of the community, but none of those meetings included my input. As a rancher whose property bordered their neighborhood but was not technically part of the HOA, I was considered an outsider. Yet, my ranch entrance sat directly adjacent to one of their manicured trails, and apparently, my wide-open gates and grazing goats didn't fit their sterile vision of suburban perfection. One morning, I discovered that the entrance gate to my ranch had been forcibly shut and bolted with heavy-duty chains. It wasn't just closed. It was locked with commercial-grade hardware, as if I had no right to enter or exit my own land. No letter, no phone call, no due process, just a blatant violation of property rights. I immediately checked my property, lines and legal easements. Everything was still intact and clearly showed I owned full access to that gate. But it was now rendered useless by an action taken without my knowledge or consent. The HOA president later claimed it was for safety, citing vague concerns about my animals potentially wandering onto HOA property. That was nonsense. I'd been running this ranch for years, with secure fencing and a flawless record of animal management. Not once had a goat broken free, nor had there been any complaints backed by evidence. This wasn't about safety, it was about power. They didn't want a ranch spoiling their view, so they took matters into their own hands. Worse yet, this unauthorized blockade caused immediate issues. My feed delivery truck couldn't access the property. I had a vet appointment scheduled for one of the goats, which had to be canceled due to the obstruction. My livestock, creatures that rely on a strict routine of care and movement, were being affected directly. I had nearly 100 goats relying on access to open pastures. Instead, they were now confined to a smaller area, causing stress among the herd. Stressed goats become aggressive, and aggressive goats cause damage. The HOA underestimated what it means to interfere with agricultural land. Unlike a lawn or a backyard, a ranch is an operational space, one that functions daily like a business. Interrupting that operation causes financial loss, physical harm to animals, and legal consequences. But clearly, they thought that by cutting off my main gate, I'd be pressured into submitting or abandoning my land. I documented everything. Photos of the chained gate, timestamps, and correspondence attempts with the HOA. I knew the law, and I knew they had overstepped, but I also knew that reacting too quickly could make matters worse. I decided to gather more evidence and give them a short window to admit fault and correct the situation. I sent them a certified letter demanding the gate be unlocked within 72 hours or face legal action for trespass and obstruction of access to private property. Their response? Silence. Not a word. They figured I was bluffing or too isolated to fight back. But what they didn't anticipate was that by trapping my animals, they'd unintentionally created a powder keg of chaos ready to explode. My goats weren't just livestock. They were strong, intelligent creatures used to a certain freedom and pattern. Locking them in was not only inhumane, it was unsustainable. As the days passed, the tension built. The goats became more agitated, and the ranch began to feel like a ticking time bomb. The HOA had made a major miscalculation, and I wasn't about to sit back and let them get away with it. What started as a petty move to make me fall in line would soon become a full-blown community spectacle, one they'd regret ever triggering. The battle between suburban arrogance and rancher resilience was just beginning. Goats are creatures of habit, And when that routine is disrupted, especially by confinement, things can escalate quickly. Under normal circumstances, my goats are free to move between several grazing sections across the ranch, keeping them healthy, relaxed, and productive. But when the HOA illegally locked my gates, it caused a chain reaction of stress within the herd. They became territorial, hyperactive, and unusually vocal. The usual grazing schedule was off, and with nowhere to roam, their frustration began to boil over. Each goat has a natural instinct to explore, climb, and chew. It's not just a quirk, it's in their biology. They are highly intelligent and can sense shifts in environment and energy. The locked gates, the lack of movement, the sudden absence of routine, all of it triggered restlessness. Some of the younger males began headbutting fence posts, while others aggressively challenged each other for space. Feed consumption dropped, which is always a red flag. Even worse, their agitation began to spread through the entire herd like wildfire. Then came the tipping point. Near the western fence of my property lies a rarely used corner adjacent to a strip of HOA-owned greenbelt. It's a heavily landscaped area that the HOA cherishes, not because of any functional value, but because it's one of their signature views for residents on morning walks. That fence corner had never been a problem before, but now, with the goats hyper-alert and testing boundaries, a few of them started digging and pressing against it with unusual determination. Goats are escape artists when they're motivated, and nothing motivates them more than boredom and confinement. Within hours, a handful of the more determined ones discovered a weak point where years of soil erosion had loosened a lower plank. It wasn't broken, just vulnerable. And it was all they needed. One squeeze, one push, and just like that, the barrier was breached. The first wave of goats didn't hesitate. They funneled through the gap and found themselves standing at the edge of the greenbelt, fresh grass, ornamental plants, and untouched HOA landscaping stretched out like a buffet. Word spreads fast in a herd. Where one goes, others follow. Within minutes, nearly a third of the goats had poured through the weak spot and were trampling across the HOA's prized lawns. It wasn't deliberate revenge. It was instinctual chaos. The goats didn't understand boundaries or property lines. They only saw open terrain that had been previously off limits. And now nothing was stopping them. They munched on shrubs, yanked petunias from flower beds, and climbed atop patio furniture. Lawn decorations were toppled, sprinkler heads chewed off, and mulch beds torn up by hooves. These weren't minor disturbances. These were full-blown property-damaging incursions, fueled by days of tension and a sudden explosive outlet. The HOA's pristine aesthetics were no match for the fury of a frustrated herd. Back at the ranch, I received a barrage of frantic calls and texts from HOA members. At first, it was angry complaints. Then, it shifted to desperation as they realized they couldn't stop the herd themselves. Goats don't respond to yelling. They don't fear little orange cones or makeshift fences. And once they're loose, gathering them takes skill and experience. Two things the HOA clearly lacked. The irony was thick. These were the same people who had locked me out of my own gates to protect the neighborhood from the threat of livestock. Now they were running through their yards trying to chase down those same animals with rakes and leaf blowers, completely unprepared for the chaos they'd unleashed. Their perfect suburban order had been overrun, not by vandals, not by teenagers, but by goats they had effectively caged in. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. The HOA's obsessive need for control had backfired in the most outrageous poetic way imaginable. Their insistence on standards and image had directly led to the destruction of the very image they were trying to protect. And their smug assumptions about ranchers being out of place in their community had just been head-butted into oblivion by a dozen angry goats. Meanwhile, I continued documenting everything, not just for legal purposes, but to expose the sheer absurdity of the situation. The HOA had created a mess entirely of their own making, and the fallout had only just begun. The Greenbelt was ruined, homeowners were livid, and the HOA board was in damage control mode. But the real reckoning was still coming, and it would go far beyond shredded lawns. It would strike at the heart of their authority. And that battle was one I was ready for. The moment the goats burst through the weak spot in the fence and stormed into HOA territory, it marked the beginning of a full-scale reckoning, a wild and unstoppable event that would quickly earn the nickname the Great Goat Invasion. What began as an unintentional breach driven by frustration and confinement spiraled into a surreal spectacle that laid bare the ridiculous rigidity of HOA control. Goats, unlike dogs or livestock that can be herded or intimidated, are creatures of curiosity and tenacity. Once the first wave found its way into the HOA's manicured paradise, they didn't just graze. They explored, tested boundaries, and challenged everything the HOA stood for. The prized lawns, trimmed with military precision, were instantly turned into obstacle courses. Goats leaped onto patio furniture, toppled ornamental statues, and chewed through decorative light strands like they were weeds. Their hooves trampled through garden beds filled with expensive seasonal flowers that residents had spent hours perfecting. Hydrangeas were eaten down to the stems. Tulips and marigolds disappeared in mouthfuls. One resident's elaborate koi pond fountain was reduced to a muddy crater after a group of goats walked straight through it, oblivious to the chaos they left behind. Lawn irrigation systems, carefully hidden beneath the turf, were unearthed and destroyed by bored hooves. Residents, seeing their slice of controlled suburban heaven under siege, tried everything to stop the invasion. Sprinklers were activated in panic, but goats treated them like a refreshing game. Some tried chasing them off with leaf blowers, but the goats merely trotted a few feet away and returned as soon as the noise stopped. Makeshift barriers of patio chairs and garden hoses were no match. The HOA had created an environment that looked flawless on the surface, but it had no real defense against nature's fury, especially when that fury had horns and 4 legs. The HOA board, notorious for issuing fines over mailbox paint shades and grass height violations, was suddenly powerless. These were the same people who bragged about the standards of excellence in every newsletter, the same ones who cited bylaws for everything from curtain colors to the acceptable height of decorative hedges. Yet now, they found themselves pleading for help. Not from animal control, but from the very rancher they had locked out of his own property. Word of the goat rampage spread rapidly through group chats, neighborhood forums, and even local news outlets. Drones captured overhead footage of the invasion, showing goats cascading over fences, resting in lounge chairs, and sunbathing on rooftops. Videos went viral almost immediately. The HOA's embarrassment became public spectacle, with internet commenters cheering on the goats as symbols of rebellion against overregulation and petty power. The residents, meanwhile, were divided. Some, fed up with the HOA's oppressive behavior, secretly laughed or even filmed the chaos. Others were furious, not at the goats, but at the board members who had escalated things to this level. Homeowners who once supported the HOA now found themselves questioning why their homes were at risk, why this level of drama had reached their quiet cul-de-sac, and why no one had warned them that the decision to lock the ranch gates could lead to an invasion of livestock. What added another layer of irony was the HOA's own maintenance staff. Underpaid and untrained to handle large animals, they stood helplessly as goats devoured their day's landscaping work. Dozens of planters, freshly delivered for a seasonal upgrade, were torn apart within minutes. Mulch beds were dug up like sandboxes. One goat chewed through the wires of a brand-new holiday lighting display installed just the day before. The HOA's $50,000 annual beautification budget had been rendered meaningless in a matter of hours. Legal consequences started to loom large. Property owners began threatening lawsuits, not against the rancher, but against the HOA board for failing. To manage the situation, insurance claims flooded in for destroyed landscaping, damaged outdoor structures, and in some cases, injuries caused by residents trying to wrangle animals they had no business confronting. The HOA's liability became the hot topic in emergency meetings, where panic replaced the smug confidence that had once filled the boardroom. This wasn't just a goat invasion. It was the physical manifestation of every suppressed frustration, every unjust fine, every arrogant policy the HOA had enforced without accountability. And now those grievances had horns and a hunger for geraniums. The board had underestimated both the consequences of their own overreach and the power of nature to disrupt even the most artificial order. The goats had no idea they were making history, but that's exactly what they did. They didn't just destroy lawns, they tore down the illusion of control that the HOA had so carefully cultivated. The message was clear. When you push people and animals too far, something will eventually push back. And in this case, that something was a herd of angry, hungry goats who gave the HOA exactly what it deserved. The HOA's attempt to retaliate unfolded with the kind of arrogance that had become its signature move. They believed they could control every inch of the community, even extending their reach to private ranch land they technically had no authority over. In their desperation to regain control of the narrative, they made the critical error of assuming I wouldn't be prepared. They called animal control, hoping to pin the goat invasion on me, framing it as a reckless and dangerous act. But they underestimated just how buttoned up my legal and operational documents were. Every animal was licensed. Every structure on. My ranch was code compliant. My fencing, while partially damaged due to their obstruction, was built to county specifications. Most importantly, I had clear recorded deeds and property rights that explicitly excluded me from HOA governance. I had never agreed to be a part of the HOA, nor was there any legal annexation of my land into their jurisdiction. Their bolting of my gate, in fact, was the actual violation, a blatant case of trespassing and unlawful interference with property. As the HOA tried to weaponize government agencies against me, I went on the offensive. I filed a lawsuit for illegal obstruction of access, tampering with private property, and damages incurred from their actions. Thanks to the footage I'd collected and the witnesses who had seen HOA members install the bolts themselves, the evidence was irrefutable. Local officials who reviewed the case noted multiple violations of both state and municipal property laws. The HOA had no authority to alter any structure or restrict access to land outside their legal boundary, and yet that's exactly what they did. And they did it in writing. My legal counsel moved swiftly, presenting documentation of my permits, the easement rights that allowed access through the community road, and the HOA's previous correspondences that proved a pattern of overreach and harassment. The court took one look at the case and issued an injunction, ordering the HOA to immediately cease any interaction with my property. Worse for them, the judge allowed the case to proceed to civil damages, meaning the HOA would now face financial penalties for their unlawful actions. The HOA board, once so proud and smug, was in full panic mode. Not only had their scheme backfired, but their insurance provider was now backing away from covering the impending claims. Their own bylaws, designed to enforce obedience within the community, were powerless in the face of real legal accountability. Their status meant nothing in a courtroom. The threat of heavy fines and public embarrassment began to split the board internally. Some members wanted to settle. Others were still clinging to the illusion of authority. Meanwhile, Animal Control's visit turned out to be a non-event. Upon inspection, they found that not only were my goats healthy and properly kept, but the entire incident stemmed from the HOA's tampering with a secure enclosure. They documented my claims of gate obstruction and filed their own report, which further validated my lawsuit. In a rare twist, their official findings actually supported the rancher, and not the governing body of the neighborhood. By trying to turn me into the villain, the HOA had done what it always did: act without thinking, overstep its boundaries, and hope that intimidation would cover its legal deficiencies. But this time, it wasn't dealing with a passive homeowner afraid of conflict. It was dealing with someone who knew how to fight back, and more importantly, someone who could prove every claim with documented facts and lawful actions. As news of the court proceedings reached residents, cracks in community loyalty began to show. Homeowners who once trusted the board now questioned its competence and judgment. Whispers of removing board members and rewriting HOA policies spread like wildfire. The very institution that had controlled the neighborhood for years was now the one being scrutinized, exposed for its overreach and arrogance. The HOA had tried to break me through unlawful retaliation, but instead it broke itself by revealing just how far it was willing to go and how little it actually understood about the limits of its power. The pressure bearing down on the HOA became unbearable as the legal process advanced. Mounting public scrutiny, financial liability, and internal dissent created the perfect storm that forced the board into full retreat. After months of resistance, they finally conceded to a settlement. Their attorney, now clearly operating damage control, approached my legal team with terms that included a full written apology, reimbursement for all legal fees, repair costs for the ranch gate, and a legally binding agreement to cease any further action against me or my property. It was a total surrender, one born not out of goodwill, but out of desperation to avoid further public embarrassment and escalating damages. The apology letter was distributed not only to me, but also publicly posted in the HOA's community bulletin and online newsletter. It was a rare and humbling admission of fault, something the board had never done before. They admitted to overstepping legal boundaries, acknowledged their unauthorized gate tampering, and publicly apologized for the harassment they directed toward me and my property. The language was clear, decisive, and, most importantly, legally binding. They knew that one more misstep could trigger another round of costly legal action they couldn't afford to defend against. The community's response was overwhelming. Residents who had once feared speaking out against the HOA now felt empowered. Several came forward with their own grievances, emboldened by the outcome of my case. The illusion of HOA invincibility was shattered. Confidence in the leadership crumbled, and soon a vote was held to remove several key members of the board. New leadership promised transparency, restraint, and a full audit of previous actions taken by the HOA against homeowners. What began as an isolated conflict evolved into a neighborhood-wide reckoning with abuse of authority. Meanwhile, my goats, the accidental heroes of this whole ordeal, took on a life of their own in the community's collective imagination. What had started as a simple act of grazing became legendary. Kids in the neighborhood began drawing pictures of them, local businesses named menu items after them, and one resident even commissioned a cartoon mural at a nearby park featuring the herd storming castle-like lawns. It wasn't long before a regional news outlet picked up the story, airing a lighthearted feature segment that praised the goats for their defense of ranch rights. The piece went viral, racking up hundreds of thousands of views and turning my ranch into a local point of pride. Capitalizing on the positive press, I launched a small by-appointment goat petting experience for families, donating a portion of proceeds to local animal shelters. The community, once divided by the HOA's oppressive rules, now had something wholesome and rebellious to rally behind. My goats were no longer just livestock. They were symbols of standing up to bullies with power. The HOA's downfall was poetic justice, but it also served a greater purpose. It reminded everyone that power unchecked becomes tyranny, and that even small acts of resistance, like letting goats roam free in protest, can spark significant change. The community, now freshly united, began advocating for sensible reforms. New homeowners were encouraged to understand their rights, and former board members were held accountable for their role in the gate fiasco. The narrative had shifted permanently, from one of fear and compliance to one of empowerment and unity. I maintained my distance from the HOA going forward, as the settlement agreement ensured they couldn't legally come near my land again. I reinvested some of the settlement funds into enhancing the ranch, building better fencing, adding cameras, and even installing a humorous "Beware of Goats" sign at the entrance that had become a popular photo spot for visitors. The property had not only survived the conflict, it had thrived, becoming a landmark in its own right. The final victory wasn't just the apology or the payout, it was the cultural shift. The HOA, once a symbol of control and overreach, was now cautious and restrained. The residents, once docile and afraid, had found their voice. And my ranch, once a quiet piece of land tucked just outside HOA bounds, became the unlikely ground zero for a story of resistance, resilience, and ridiculous goats that no one in town would ever forget. This saga proved one simple truth. When people stand up for their rights, even the most entitled powers can be humbled. Sometimes, all it takes is a locked gate, an angry rancher, and a few determined goats to change everything. If you love seeing HOA bullies get what they deserve, subscribe now to the House Stories for more jaw-dropping tales of justice.